what it is to be an artist in 2016. It's exciting and it's confusing, but it's changing so fast. What was a good deal last year is obsolete 3 months later.
The route to becoming a recording artist used to be straightforward. Today, the possibilities seem endless.
Big numbers increasingly become smaller numbers, and those smaller numbers have to last you as long as it takes to release a record. If you sign an old school music industry contract today, you are literally flogging yourself.
Adam Bainbridge records under the name Kindness. In the business of music, in this new age of streaming, how you get paid is more complex than ever.
I saw a royalty statement for the first time, and you're trying to work out if what you're being paid is correct or not. It took 3 university graduates to make head or tails of it. It can just fry your mind. I work with such talented musicians that in an era previously would be part of the Wrecking Crew or the Funk Brothers, these great musicians now are struggling for income. Being able to look at a long-term career in music is less likely.
We have heard quite a lot of doom and gloom, the last 15 years, and from Napster and on.
But as the music industry enters a new chapter, could data change the stakes in that old battle between creators and commerce?
Today, I see, with this technology, with this transparency, that we can double the music industry within 3 years.
You genuinely think that the worth of the music industry can be doubled from now over the next 3 years?
Yes.
Of all the creative industries, music has faced the most disruption. Last week we heard how the major record labels failed to see a change in how people consume music.
When you're faced with free, it's prohibition. Everyone's drinking.
Roger Ames used to run Warner Music, but when technology is changing, businesses have to change too. But wary of a power shift, the industry set about suing its customers.
I was like, this is completely ridiculous. We're going to sue people, but we're not giving them an alternative. And the only alternative we're giving them is to go to Walmart. That's the alternative. And here you can have the world's music at your fingertips. So you're going, oh, no, we're going to send them to Walmart. Pass.
Apple's iTunes offered an alternative and the chance to buy an MP3 rather than an album. Soon the CD market collapsed and the industry consolidated.
Yeah, I wish I could tell people that they have to pay me £15 for a record that isn't very good, that only has 1 track on it, but I can't.
Around 2004-05, when the industry started to collapse, what we started to see here was growth.
Alison Wenham is from the Association of Independent Music. For the labels who didn't have the marketing power of the majors, the internet allowed thousands of bands to find new audiences. And in this second episode, I want to concentrate on how the industry's downturn affected these artists and the independent sector.
We saw a big increase in the number of companies starting up. The majors at that point were still dead against anything to do with the internet, and this turned everything on its head. What drives majors primarily is making money.
Well, I think the 2 leading companies for many, many years, a good 20 to 30 years, was the CBS Record Group and the great Warner Brothers, and its leading executive was Mo Austin.
Daniel Glass runs Glass Note Recordings, home to Mumford & Sons and Phoenix. After working for the biggest corporate names in music, he set up his own independent record label.
You were trained and groomed in the music industry that the third album would take care of everything. It's about building fan bases. It's about connections. That ended when people got very single-oriented. And that had to do with the ownership of the major labels, which drove people to making their quarters and making their profits. And I think that word patience is something that separates the independents from the majors.
An eclectic roster and a select number of releases has proven enormously successful for Richard Russell. He's CEO of Excel Recordings, home to artists like Jack White, The XX, and Adele.
I'm drawn to uncompromising characters. That is the type of character Adele is. It's where you're working with people who could easily have succeeded without you. The people that are best to work with are the people who don't need you.
And when the morning comes, if there's been no rest for you.
Last year, Adele generated around £25 million of retail sales revenue, equivalent to 70% of the UK's total music sales.
Because I was keen to work with ambitious artists through working with Prodigy from very early on, and they made that transition themselves.
The Prodigy were signed to XL and became one of the biggest bands of the 90s.
And it struck me that that's what the label needed to be about, the musical aesthetic integrity of only putting out things that are good, but the ambition that Majors brought to things. Businesses have a tendency to grow, there's a lot of pressure on businesses to grow. I'm not interested in any of those ideas, and I suppose in a way I'm completely sort of anti-business. Now, Majors have this thing called market share. So not only are they trying to win, they want other people to lose. And that's going to bring a whole lot of pressures and complexities to things which might be quite alien to an artistic approach.
Like in the 70s or whatever, at Columbia, you know, they would sign somebody like Bruce Springsteen and give him 3-4 albums and see how things went.
Bobby Gillespie from the band Primal Scream.
Like the first Springsteen album never sold, and neither did the second. So these days, somebody like Bruce Springsteen would be out in his arse. You know, they want instant returns. It's just the way it is.
"2007 was a bad year for record labels. CD sales continued to nosedive, and digital downloads failed to compensate. EMI, the home of the Beatles, Pink Floyd and Queen, faced problems. Soon a private equity firm would try and reinvent the music business by cutting the huge costs of fruit and flowers. Big-name artists bypassed the record labels to strike deals with concert promoters and coffee shops. Artists like Radiohead sought alternatives, like releasing their album In Rainbows for free.
You know, they were burnt. They were burnt by the whole business.
Ed O'Brien from Radiohead.
The whole environment was very, very hard for these record companies because they were big. They were really, really big, and they had to shrink.
The industry had some serious problems to fix. That was why I got my salary and what got me out of bed every morning.
Rob Wells, former president of global digital business at Universal Music.
Understand, the music industry is very complicated. It's an old business because it's founded in copyright, but it's still, you know, it's a machine for making money. And all we had to do was find the right solution for that consumer demand, find it, license it, and then allow it to flourish and grow.
The labels were slowly learning that you can't fight piracy with lawsuits. Instead, they looked to develop a more enticing business proposition.
So I led the team that did the first Spotify deal for Universal Music Group. And subscription wasn't a new thing. There were already subscription platforms that were out there. But what we saw in the Spotify platform, the engineering, was a complete focus on what consumers wanted. Take your eyes off what the consumers are doing, you're dead.
Sweden was this hotbed of piracy. When Daniel and Martin, who founded the company, when they started it, they're both from Stockholm and Sweden, they sat down and they wanted to create something that was going to convince people to start paying again.
Spotify was designed to make listening to music easier than downloading it illegally, for free with adverts or as an ad-free subscriber. Mark Williamson is head of artist services at Spotify.
You know, we were their last option, and then what happened is things started to really look great in Sweden. So that started to actually put some pressure around the world to go, okay, well, would this work in our country? The big challenge with Spotify is it's not just a format change, it's a complete change in the way that you consume music. And that has presented challenges because you have an industry that's built up over 100 years to serve a particular business model. And now then you bring in this entirely new model that is actually designed to be different because the old model had broken.
So what it was Naomi and I were cooking dinner and opening the mail. In the mail was our royalty statement, and Naomi, she opened it up and she said, is this right? Am I reading this right?
Damon Krakowski is from American band Galaxy 500 and Damon and Naomi. 4 years ago, he revealed how much he was receiving from Spotify.
I tweeted, one little factoid about our own royalties, the song from our first band, Galaxy 500, Tugboat, which was our first single too. It had been played thousands and thousands of times. We've been paid pennies.
Since details of Spotify's payments first emerged, artists have been questioning the model. Taylor Swift, one of the biggest names in music, pulled her music from Spotify. Tom York from Radiohead called it the last desperate fart of a dying corpse. The musical ecosystem is clearly disturbed.
When we started, there was a very simple exchange going on. We pressed a record, we knew the cost, we sold it for more than we paid, and we made a profit. Like that is, you could open up a lemonade stand. So you make a product, you sell it. That's how records were for us. And I subscribe to Spotify. It's an amazing service. I have no problem with that. I pay them more than they're paying me, really. I have a problem with them calling what they send me royalties.
How does Spotify pay its artists?
That gets to core of it. Spotify doesn't pay artists directly. Spotify licenses music from rights holders, so from labels and publishers. Labels and publishers will do a deal with an artist to be able to exploit their rights. We go to the labels, the major labels, and also independent labels. And at the end of every month, we look at how much their music, that particular label, has been streamed, and we pay them a proportion of all of our revenue. We pay out around about 70% of every pound, dollar, euro that we make, and we pay that to the rights holders, not to the artists themselves. When we pay those rights holders, we give them all the information they need to understand which of their artists, their repertoire, have been streamed, and then the label will pay the artist depending on the commercial deal that they have.
I mean, how do you respond to if there is a Joanna Newsom or a Tom York who is very publicly attacking the service? There's no other word for it.
The pot that we bring in is continually growing. We paid out, in the first 5 years that we were around, we paid out $500 million. And then last year alone, we paid out over $1 billion in just 1 year. If you go back to year one on Spotify, even the biggest stars in the world were making very little because we as a business made very little. Now, you've got artists on Spotify that we're paying out for their rights, $15, $20 million a year just for one artist's rights. And that will continue to get paid on year after year after year after year. So actually the amount of money that an artist would earn on a month-to-month basis if they had the same amount of popularity does go up. For every artist like that, there is another artist that emails me directly and says, we put our song on Spotify. We got added to a playlist, we got a few million plays, and we made $20,000, for example. We use that money to go into the studio. That artist is completely independent, and they get the money directly, whereas another artist might have signed a deal 5 years ago. They might have taken an advance, and they may never have actually paid back that advance.
In terms of the majors, how have they invested in Spotify, and how does that relationship work?
We worked with the labels from day one. The labels became investors. We are undeniably partners in trying to grow this industry, but of course, they're just one of our partners.
The corporations that own the major labels have done deals with the streaming services under cover of non-disclosure agreement that have caused a lot of problems.
In order to get to where they are today, Spotify made deals with the major labels and the independents. They in turn used the power of their catalogues to get a percentage of Spotify ownership, thought to be close to 20%. Brian Message, a partner in the management firm that manages Radiohead.
Ultimately, I look at the Spotify business model where they're paying 70% and more over to the recorded music industry, and then you see how little has actually come back into the artist community. There's got to be questions to ask as to where is it?
I think that the relationship with the artist community is fractured. That's come about because of, and you see it in the press all the time, the streaming revenues, the suspicion, the lack of transparency.
Alison Wenham is from the Association of Independent Music.
I know some artists who are still having ad campaigns being deducted from the 80s.
Paul Pacifico, Chief Executive of the Featured Artists Coalition.
Sony Music is being sued at the moment by 19 Management, a management company. Sony's defence in court, when challenged over their deal with Spotify, the fact that it prejudiced artists disproportionately, was yes, our deal did prejudice the artists, but it's our legal right to do that.
We were signed at the end of 91 with EMI. On every album sold, we'd receive 12% of the income on that.
Ed O'Brien from Radiohead.
All those bits like packaging deductions and all that stuff, which were for records and CDs and cassettes at that time, they still applied them to streaming. That was the really, really hard thing with dealing with a major, is that you deal with some, still got friends, fantastic people. They help break us. But the other side of the building, you got business feds who are screwing you down.
It's a great Irving Azoff quote. I don't understand why I have to give the artist 80% of my money.
Roger Ames, former CEO of Warner Music Group.
Yeah, record companies get a bad rap, and in some cases they deserve it. I'm sure, read the Alan Klein book. They were all thieves. I don't think they're all thieves now.
You've probably heard this song before, but try to understand.
The record company buys a horse, trains a horse, feeds a horse, runs a horse, and hopefully one day wins a race. The record company gets 70% and the artist gets 30%. So maybe that'll change over time.
I wish I could show.
Jeff Taylor is from the music industry trade body, the BPI.
They provide the funding to allow an artist to concentrate full-time on being a musician. And then the expertise that they have in pairing artists with producers, helping them to create the very best recording that they can, and then crucially market that recording, is indispensable.
We remain in a system where three large corporations are essentially the lender of last resort to the music industry.
Paul Pacifico.
Can you imagine going to a high street bank and saying, I'm an artist, I've got an idea for an album, it's going to be great. Will you lend me some money? You can imagine the response is probably going to be no.
That's always the key, the money.
Peter Mensch is one of the founders of Q Prime Management. They count Metallica, Muse, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers on their books. Their scale means they're able to adopt many of the functions of a major label.
Metallica owns their entire catalog and has direct deals with Spotify and iTunes, so we see the checks. We get paid like a record company does. It's very healthy. Why does the label get a much larger share? That's the conundrum we're wrestling with now. If the entire business goes to all streaming, and it certainly looks like it's headed that way, then I start questioning what the record company's going to do for me that I can't do for myself.
What technology has done, it's enabled artists to look at themselves as businesses.
Brian Message.
Multiple revenue streams with an ability to be able to trade all over the world. Recorded music is the language of that business. Doesn't necessarily make it easier.
Do you see new bands that you know finding it kind of tough to get going?
I know a few bands in East London that everybody's got a job on the side, because I think that no major record label is going to invest in rock bands like that anymore. Whereas back in early, mid to late 90s, major labels would have been signing these bands up.
I'll never smile. You do need a team. The team may not have to be a major label, it may not have to be an independent label. You do need a team. But the nuances of artist development, which will last and get you on the main stage of Glastonbury, it takes a lot of work by a team. Live is very, very good for someone's career. The selling of the t-shirts, the merchandise. We have a band called Mumford & Sons, and that band does very well with record sales, very well with streaming. They actually have grown into their own festivals now.
Even though the recorded business is about half the size now that it was, the entire music business altogether is actually about the same size.
Industry analyst Mark Mulligan.
For almost every pound that the recorded business lost, the live business gained. That's what Napster started.
The artists always could have charged more for their concert tickets, but they didn't. They treated it more as a lost leader, as a way of becoming popular and selling more recordings.
Alan Kruger was one of President Obama's economic advisors. He believes in the live music industry, the rich are getting richer, while the rest are being left behind.
Over the last 20 years, the music industry has become even more of a superstar industry, with the very top performing artists reaping an even larger share of concert revenue.
But there must be limits on the amount that a musician can charge for a gig or an album or a song.
Well, there are limits, and I think we're approaching the limits, although For the very best performers and for the very best seats, I think there's still some room for prices to grow. The rewards are much more concentrated on a small handful of performers. I think it's a real challenge for artists who are starting up.
Yeah, this is the great thing about people telling me that the live business must be better. It's great for Metallica, absolutely. But if I told you how much money Foles made on their English and European tour, after they paid all their expenses, you'd sit there and go, and split it 5 ways? You sit there and go, wow, gee.
If you think that the recorded music business was blind to change, multiply that many times over for what the live music business is. You've got so many vested interests which have hiked the prices, and the future of live is also going to be something that will be turned upside down.
If we don't make bigger artists out of the smaller artists, then you're going to be sitting here going, oh my God, I'm going to see Paul McCartney for the 99th time at Glastonbury. I'm just joking. I'm sure that'd be great to see Paul McCartney.
If the myth of live music being the saviour of bands in the industry isn't true, where is a band going to find stability?
They're not going to be a band anymore. That's my point. Working in the music business was a viable business. You could graduate university and decide you want to be in the music business, right? And there would be jobs available. There'd be record companies high and low. It's no longer that way.
We have heard quite a lot of doom and gloom, the last 15 years, and from Napster and on. Today, I see with this technology, with this transparency, that we can double the music industry within 3 years.
You genuinely think that the worth of the music industry can be doubled from now over the next 3 years?
Yes.
Willard Aritz founded Cobalt 16 years ago. The company connects royalties for songwriters and music publishers and works with thousands of artists, including Nick Cave, Tom York and Paul McCartney. Willard believes that with thousands of new income streams, the old accounting models were failing the artists.
You waited 2-3 years for your money, you couldn't understand the statements, and the service level was very bad. Our artists and writers, in average, people are getting the money up to 2 years faster and 30% more. We increased, for example, the Spotify collection by 130% and iTunes by 30%.
So if you're saying that artists with Cobalt are earning 30% more, would that imply that other artists, they're not being served best by the major labels?
I can just talk for Cobalt. There is a lot of money and people get paid.
Streaming needs to scale up to be truly effective. 67 million people subscribed to a streaming service last year, an increase of 24 million from the previous year. And although Spotify is the leading player, Apple is close behind. The problem is that record deals aren't future-proof. Jeff Taylor from the BPI.
It is extremely complex. The music industry as it's now structured, if you're an artist, your music will be available on hundreds of digital platforms all around the world, all of which have different deals, and it's confusing. One of the big challenges is that the total amount that's coming back into the music industry is much smaller than it ought to be, because there are services which offer music for free, which take the position that they don't need a license. A music company will receive many times as much revenue from a Spotify user as it does from a YouTube user.
Google happily says they make 97% of their money from advertising, and we spend all of our time trying to talk to Google saying you have to pay the music industry a sort of moral fee for the music that you use.
Joe Dipple is CEO of UK Music, the campaigning and lobbying organisation for the music industry.
They're not paying the creators of music enough money.
Well, YouTube, they're the devil. The only way you make money is on advertising around your videos or whatever. If someone doesn't do something about YouTube, we're screwed. It's over. Turn off the lights.
We spoke to Peter Mensch, who said YouTube is the devil for the enormously low amount of return that his artists get.
Right.
And these are big artists. These are huge people.
The opposing arguments, which is you should look at somebody like Lindsey Sterling. She makes more money than probably most of these guys combined through YouTube.
Robert Kinsel is the CBO of YouTube. Lindsey Sterling, who came to our attention through an American talent show, is a hip-hop violinist. Robert explains that she's made $6 million from YouTube last year alone.
It really depends on how successful you are in terms of driving viewership. What is the flow of the money from us to you? Lindsay is set up directly with YouTube, and she sees exactly all of her consumption on YouTube and how much money she's making. It's very clear. In other cases, maybe less so.
What you're inferring is that the pipe between you and the artist is maybe there's breakages or stoppages there.
There are middlemen, right, whether it's collection societies, publishers, labels, but also what they do is they fund content and they give advances and they want those recouped. So it's just really hard when there's no transparency for the artist.
And there are clearly NDAs in place between you guys and the major labels. You can see why artists are feeling they're being treated unfairly.
Yeah, so I can say that we would be very happy to share the information if we could.
Music is everywhere, and the industry is in growth again, but it's fragile. A decade ago, it was in serious trouble, but it's learnt to embrace technology and now seems to be on a firmer footing. What worries me is that the disruption isn't over. Streaming itself isn't strong enough to carry the weight of the industry yet, and huge mistakes could still be made if artists aren't being paid for what they create.
Leaving the impression that artists are being ripped off puts off consumers from paying. That if people stop paying for stuff, you stop the cycle of reinvestment and you end up with a very short-term view. This golden age for the consumer needs to be balanced by a certain sense of commercial reality.
Music is one of the most successful businesses that the UK has. If you look at the top 10 best-selling artists in the world, 5 of them were British.
Would you become a musician now?
I would definitely become a musician now, because I don't think it's not a career, it's a calling, isn't it? If you don't have a choice, you can't do anything else.
The music industry are collectively holding their breath for when finally Spotify goes public, because they know the investment community is watching. And if Spotify doesn't have a successful IPO, the music industry does not have a plan B.
The music industry is famous for not being able to get out of its own way. There's so many stakeholders. To launch a new service, massive thinking, massive expense. You then have to sit down and negotiate a deal with all the major labels, the independent sector, the publishing sector, the collecting societies on a territory by territory basis. Ball ache. It's not over yet, and it can still go wrong.